For 22 years, one man stood close enough to Vladimir Putin to hear him breathe, close enough to watch him sign the orders that killed hundreds of thousands, close enough to know which pills he swallows, which doubles wear his face, and which bunker hides him when the world thinks he's in Moscow. That man just defected to Ukraine. Let that sink in. A member of Putin's personal bodyguard team, a man from the most trusted ring of the Kremlin's protective service, walked across the line and started talking. And what he is reportedly telling Ukrainian intelligence is the kind of information that rewrites the entire war. Today, I'm walking you through 10 explosive reasons this single defection may be the most damaging blow Putin has suffered since 2022. Reason number 7 is the one that should keep him awake. Tonight, stay with me until the end. If this video opened your eyes even a little, do something most viewers never do. Drop a comment with just one word that describes how Putin is feeling right now. Because I read every single one and your word might end up in the next video. And if you believe truth deserves a louder voice than propaganda, hit subscribe. It's one click, it's free, and it tells us to keep digging where others won't. Here's the first reason this defection is a nightmare for the Kremlin, and it starts with a question nobody in Western intelligence has ever been able to fully answer. Where is Vladimir Putin really? For years, the Kremlin has played an elaborate shell game with Putin's location. State television shows him meeting officials in Moscow on a Tuesday, but flight data tracked by independent investigators places his plane in Sochi the same morning. He appears at a factory in the Urals, but the snow on the boots of his security detail doesn't match the weather that day. Multiple credible sources, including Ukraine's own intelligence chief Kirill Budanov, have stated publicly that Putin uses body doubles. Different jawlines, different ears, different walking patterns. The man you see on Russian television is not always the man making the decisions. A personal bodyguard ends that mystery in a single afternoon of debriefing. He knows when the real Putin boards the helicopter and when an empty convoy rolls out as a decoy. He knows which of the residences, the Novo-Ogoryovo complex, the Valdai retreat, the Black Sea Palace, are used regularly and which are theatrical sets for state television. He knows the rotation patterns, the favorite airfields, the timing windows when Putin actually travels versus when his motorcade moves, to confuse satellites. Why does this matter so much? Because every Western government, every intelligence service, every serious analyst has been building their entire model of Russian decision-making on guesswork about where Putin physically is and who he is meeting. And that guesswork just collapsed. And here's the part that should chill the Kremlin to the bone. Patterns are hard to change when they are built around the comfort and paranoia of an aging dictator. The bodyguard left months ago. The patterns he exposed are still being used. Today, now we get to the reason that could shape the Russian elite to its core. Because nothing in an authoritarian system matters more than the physical health of the man at the top. For years, the world has been guessing the puffy face during televised meetings, the white-knuckle grip on the table during a 2022 Security Council session, like he was holding himself upright, the trembling leg captured on camera during a sit-down with Belarus's Alexander Lukashenko, the sudden cancellations of public appearances blamed on scheduling conflicts, the strange bloating around the jaw that medical experts watching from abroad have linked to long-term steroid treatment, possibly for cancer, possibly for something worse. The Kremlin's response has always been the same: denial. Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, insists the president is in excellent health and works longer hours than men half his age. State television shows him swimming, riding horses, playing hockey. The message is relentless. The Tsar is strong. The Tsar is eternal. A bodyguard knows the truth because he sees what the cameras never capture. He sees the medical team that travels everywhere. Putin goes, doctors who are reportedly never more than a few rooms away. Any time he sees the equipment unloaded discreetly at residences in the dead of night. He sees the days when the official schedule mysteriously empties and the specialists stay for hours. He sees which medications arrive, which oncologists are flown in, which procedures happen behind closed doors. This is catastrophic intelligence for the Kremlin because the entire architecture of Putin's domestic power rests on the illusion of vitality. The moment that illusion cracks publicly with specific, sourced, credible detail, every oligarch, every Silovik, every regional governor in Russia starts quietly hedging their bets. And in a country where the next leader is chosen by whoever moves fastest, that hedging is the first tremor of an earthquake. Here is something most Western analysts will never admit publicly, but every honest one will tell you over a drink. Kremlinology is mostly educated guessing. For decades, the way the West has tried to figure out who actually holds power inside the Kremlin has been almost embarrassingly primitive. Analysts study photographs. They measure who stands closest to Putin at military parades. They count seconds of handshake duration. They track who gets invited to the annual BODYGUARD conference and who gets seated where at the impossibly long Kremlin table. It is part science, part tea leaf reading, and entirely dependent on what the Kremlin chooses to show the cameras. A personal bodyguard collapses all of that uncertainty in a single conversation. He knows who Putin actually calls when the cameras are off. He knows whose advice Putin listens to in silence and whose he dismisses with a wave of the hand the second they leave the room. He knows which Western famous Russian officials are essentially decorative furniture, men who appear on every panel and every news segment but have zero real influence on the decisions that matter. And here's where it gets fascinating. He also knows the opposite. He knows the obscure figures, the men whose names rarely appear in Western analysis, who actually shape policy from behind the curtain. Think about people like Yuri Kovalchuk, the so-called personal banker of Putin, who reportedly has more influence over Russian strategic thinking than half the official cabinet. Think about the shadow advisors who never sit at the long table, but whose phone calls Putin always takes. This rewrites how Washington, London, Brussels, and Kyiv target their sanctions and diplomatic pressure. You stop wasting leverage on the men who only look powerful. You start applying it to the men who actually move the levers. And in geopolitics, knowing the difference is the difference between winning and shouting into the void. Now we step into territory that the Kremlin guards more jealously than almost any other secret in the Russian state. Where does Putin physically hide when the world gets dangerous? Vladimir Putin does not live in a single residence. He operates from a network of secure facilities spread across Russia, each one designed for a different threat scenario, each one built to be self-sufficient for weeks or months at a time. There is the famous Novo-Ogoryovo complex outside Moscow, his primary working residence, where most of the long-table meetings you have seen on television are actually filmed. There is the Valdai retreat in the forests northwest of the capital, where Putin reportedly spends increasing amounts of time as his paranoia deepens. There is the Black Sea Palace at Zelenjik, the billion-dollar facility that the late Alexei Navalny exposed to the world in a viral documentary that the Kremlin still has not been able to live down. And then there are the facilities that almost nobody talks about. The hardened command bunker reportedly built into the Ural Mountains, designed for nuclear war contingencies. The dacha network along Lake Valdai, where Putin's family is rumored to spend holidays. The fortified compound at Bukharovsky in Sochi, where many of the most sensitive foreign policy meetings have taken place. A protective officer knows the layouts, the entry points, the defensive positions, the communications infrastructure, the escape tunnels that almost certainly exist beneath every one of these facilities, the contractors who maintain them, the suppliers who deliver food and equipment, the pilots who fly the helicopters in and out. This is not intelligence Ukraine would ever use for an assassination attempt, because that is not how this war is being fought, but it is intelligence that informs Western contingency planning, sanctions enforcement, and crisis modeling for the next decade, because every supplier is a pressure point, and every pressure point is now visible. Here's one of the great unsolved puzzles of modern intelligence work, and it is something Western agencies have spent billions of dollars trying to crack without ever fully succeeding. How does Vladimir Putin actually communicate? Putin is, by every credible account, the most electronically paranoid leader on the planet. He famously refuses to use a smartphone. He reportedly does not have a personal email address. He treats the internet like a hostile foreign country, which, from his perspective, it kind of is. According to multiple reports out of Moscow, including reporting from independent outlets like Meduza and The Insider, Putin receives his daily intelligence briefings on paper, hand-delivered by trusted couriers who walk the documents physically from the FSB and SVR headquarters to wherever the president happens to be that morning. When he needs to speak to his generals during the war in Ukraine, he reportedly uses landlines routed through dedicated secure exchanges that touch no commercial network anywhere on Earth. When he wants to talk to oligarchs, he summons them. When he wants to talk to foreign leaders, he uses a single encrypted line that is monitored by the FSO itself, which is, of course, the very service this defector belonged to. The bodyguard sees the mechanics of all of this. He knows who delivers the briefcases. He knows where the documents are stored overnight. He knows which couriers are trusted enough to handle the most sensitive materials and which are kept at arm's length. He knows when Putin reads the briefings and when he tosses them aside unread. He knows which generals actually get through on the phone and which are filtered out by gatekeepers like Nikolai Patrushev and his son Dmitry Patrushev. That intelligence exposes the real chain of command in Russia, and the real chain of command, it turns out, looks nothing like the organizational charts the West has been studying for years. Now we arrive at the reason that hits Putin where every authoritarian truly bleeds, and it is not on the battlefield. It is not in the polling numbers. It is in the bank accounts. Vladimir Putin's personal wealth has been estimated at figures ranging from $100 billion to $200 billion, which, if accurate, would make him one of the richest men who has ever lived. The late American investor Bill Browder, who has spent 2 decades trying to follow Putin's money, has publicly testified before the U.S. Congress that the true figure may be even higher. But here's the catch. Nobody has ever proven any of it. Not the Panama Papers, not the Pandora Papers, not the Feinstein files. Not a single major leak has been able to put Putin's name directly on a single offshore account. That is because Putin does not hold his wealth in his own name. He holds it through layers of wallet oligarchs, friends from his St. Petersburg youth, former judo partners, childhood neighbors, men like Yuri Kovalchuk, Arkady Rotenberg, and Gennady Timchenko, who hold extraordinary fortunes that everyone in Moscow understands are not really theirs. The money is then scattered across European real estate, Gulf banks, Hong Kong holdings, and shell companies in jurisdictions specifically designed to defeat Western investigation. A bodyguard sees the human infrastructure of this empire. He escorts the people who carry the documents. He stands watch outside the meetings where the asset transfers are discussed. He sees the wives flying to Paris with bags that never get x-rayed. He sees the children attending boarding schools in Switzerland under names that do not appear on any sanctions list. He knows the cousins, the nephews, the mistresses, the godchildren who quietly hold property that the Treasury Department has never connected to the Kremlin. For Western financial investigators, this is the equivalent of being handed the decoder ring to a vault they have been staring at for 20 years. Now we reach the reason I told you in the hook would keep Putin awake at night, and you are about to understand why. Because nothing has been guarded more obsessively by the Kremlin than the truth about Vladimir Putin's family. Officially, Putin has 2 daughters from his marriage to Lyudmila Putina, whom he divorced in 2013. Their names are Maria Vorontsova, a medical researcher specializing in endocrinology, and Katerina Tikhonova, a former acrobatic rock and roll dancer turned mathematician and tech executive. Both women have been gradually exposed by independent journalists like those at Reuters, Proact, and iStories. Despite enormous Kremlin efforts to keep them invisible, neither has ever appeared at an official state event with their father. Neither uses the surname Putin in public life. Both have been quietly added to Western sanctions lists in recent years. But here is where the story gets darker and where this defection becomes explosive. There are persistent, credible reports of additional children. The Russian investigative outlet Proact published detailed reporting in 2020 alleging that Putin has a long-term relationship with a former cleaner turned multimillionaire named Svetlana Krivonagich, with whom he reportedly fathered a daughter named Elizaveta, sometimes called Luisa Rozova. Born in 2003, there are reports of a relationship with the former Olympic gymnast Elena Kabayeva, with whom Putin is rumored to have fathered multiple sons, possibly twins, possibly hidden in Switzerland during the early years of the war. The bodyguard sees the real family gatherings. He knows who arrives at the dacha on New Year's Eve. He knows the names the household staff use behind closed doors. He knows the security details assigned to the women and children the world has never seen. And here is why this matters beyond gossip. In an authoritarian system, succession is blood. Anyone who can map Putin's real family map can also map the future of Russia itself. Now we step into the room that has obsessed every Western intelligence service since February 24, 2022, the room where Vladimir Putin sat with a handful of advisors and made the decision that has killed, by credible estimates, more than 500,000 people on both sides of the front line. Here's what we know from reporting by the Washington Post, Reuters, the Financial Times, and the brave Russian journalists who have risked their lives to dig into this story. The original invasion plan was developed in extraordinary secrecy. Even senior Russian generals were reportedly informed only days before the launch. The defense minister at the time, Sergei Shoigu, and the chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov, were inside the planning circle, but many of the field commanders who would actually execute the operation were given hours, not weeks, to prepare. The political and intelligence miscalculations behind that plan have been studied, obsessively in the West, but always from the outside, always through the narrow keyhole of intercepted communications and defectors of much lower rank. A protective officer was in the room or just outside the door, which in intelligence terms is functionally the same thing. He heard the arguments, he saw who pushed back and who saluted. He watched Alexander Bortnikov of the FSB and Sergei Naryshkin of the SVR stammer through that infamous Security Council meeting that aired on Russian television, and he knows what happened in the private sessions that were never broadcast. He saw generals get yelled at, demoted, and replaced. He watched some of them disappear from public life entirely. That eyewitness account, even partial, even carefully sanitized for operational security, fundamentally rewrites the historical record of how this war was launched. More importantly, it identifies the internal fault lines within the Russian military high command that Ukrainian and Western intelligence can keep exploiting for years to come. Now we reach a reason that in some ways is more important than all the secrets combined, because it is not about what this one man knows. It is about what his existence proves. Throughout history, every dictator has rested his survival on a single, unbreakable assumption: the men who guard him will never turn on him. The Roman emperors had their Praetorian Guard T. The Ottoman sultans had their Janissaries. The Soviet leaders had the Ninth Directorate of the KGB, and Vladimir Putin has the Federal Protective Service, the FSO, the direct lineal descendant of that same Soviet directorate. These are men who are screened more rigorously than cosmonauts. They sign lifetime non-disclosure agreements with real consequences for violation. Their families are quietly monitored. Their political reliability is tested again and again across decades of service. They are paid well. They are housed well. They are promised that as long as they remain loyal, they and their children will be untouchable in the Russian system. And one of them just walked away. Think about what that means. This man looked at the war in Ukraine. He looked at Vladimir Putin. He looked at the future of Russia. And he calculated soberly and rationally that defection to Kiev, the capital of the country Putin is trying to destroy, was the safer bet than staying inside the regime. That is not an emotional decision. That is a man doing the math on a sinking ship. The consequences inside the Kremlin are already rippling. Every FSO officer is now being revetted. Trust is fracturing. Putin will purge people he should not purge and trust people he should not trust. The institution designed to be his final wall has become a source of his deepest anxiety. And once that crack appears in the Praetorian Guard, history tells us it never closes again. And now we arrive at the final reason, the one that ties everything else together and explains why this single defection may end up being remembered as a turning point in the entire Putin era. Vladimir Putin is, by every credible account from every serious Russia scholar working today, a deeply paranoid man. And his paranoia has been getting worse, not better, with each passing year of this war. Remember the absurdly long tables during the COVID era, with Putin sitting 15 feet away from his own defense minister? Remember the 2-week quarantines imposed on anyone, including foreign heads of state, who wanted to meet him in person? Remember the steady shrinking of his inner circle, the disappearance of moderates, the rise of hardline intelligence veterans like Nikolai Patrushev who tell him exactly what he wants to hear about Americans. Conspiracies and Western decay. Now layer this defection on top of all of that. Imagine being Vladimir Putin, sitting in your fortified residence tonight and processing the fact that one of the men who carried your coat, who walked behind you through every public appearance, who stood watch outside your bedroom door while you slept, has betrayed you, has crossed the line, has sat down across from Ukrainian intelligence officers and started talking. Think about what that does to a man who already sees enemies behind every curtain. Think about the meetings that get canceled, the aides who get reassigned without explanation, the bodyguards who get rotated out, replaced, and rotated again because nobody can be fully trusted anymore. Think about the further insulation of an already isolated leader from any voice that might dare to tell him the truth about how this war is going. Here's the dangerous part. A paranoid autocrat surrounded by fewer trusted faces is a more unpredictable autocrat. And an unpredictable autocrat with the world's largest nuclear arsenal is the single most dangerous variable in the international system right now. That is not hyperbole. That is the sober conclusion of nearly every Russia expert working today.